Good morning, everyone. My name is Andrew Golden, and I am ArtsFund's Program Advocacy and Operations Manager. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, Breaking Down Barriers, Achieving Real Board Diversity and Inclusion, with Rena Henderson Mason of Bold Agenda. Before I hand things over to Rena, I have a few quick items to run through. First, this is the third and final in a series of 3 webinars we are hosting with Rena centered on building stronger boards. Information about and recordings of the first 2 webinars in the series, Broken Engagement, Why Has Our Board Checked Out, How Do We Fix It, and Optimizing the Board Chair-CEO Relationship are available on our website. You can read more about and view these at artsfund.org/events. Please be aware that this session is also being recorded, and we will be sharing a link for those who were unable to attend. I will also share this with all of you after we have it uploaded and ready to view later this week. Please feel free to share this with any board or staff from your organization. These webinars are part of ArtsFund's annual convenings programming sponsored by the Boeing Company. Our convening series provides the cultural sector a platform for sharing of resources, best practices, and perspectives to expand our collective capacity to serve our community. We partner with local, regional, and national practitioners and thought leaders like Rena and Bold Agenda to foster discussion and provide tools and training opportunities in direct response to the needs identified by regional arts and cultural organizations like all of you. Whether this is your first time joining us or if you're a returning attendee, thank you for being part of our convenings. Now for a couple logistical items. First, this webinar is in listen-only mode for attendees, meaning you are all on mute. So all questions and any comments should be typed into the question field in your control panel. We will take time for questions around the middle of the presentation and again at the end. So please add any questions you have as they arise, and we will get to them. As a reminder, this webinar is scheduled to last an hour and 15 minutes, so we're planning to wrap up around 12:15. You'll receive a survey in follow-up to this webinar, and we ask you please to take a few minutes to fill it out as we value your feedback. As I said, we developed this webinar series from input we have received from past events and conversations to best suit the needs of our cultural partners, and your responses will help set the course for future offerings like this. All right, and now before we get things started, I'd like to give a brief introduction to Rena. Rena Henderson Mason is a trusted advisor to mission-driven board and staff leaders, helping them shape their boards for high performance and tell their unique stories. She trains and coaches boards and leaders on high-performance teams, governance, fundraising, recruitment and retention, diversity and inclusion, and succession planning. Her specialty is empowering board and staff leaders to embrace change, push bold ideas, and build great teams. She has coached board chairs and executive directors and CEOs through a range of organizational challenges, including growth, leadership transitions, strategic alliances, restructuring, turnaround, and crisis. In addition to her work at Bold Agenda, Rena also serves on the Board Development Committee for the Arts Alliance of Illinois and the Chicago chapter of the National Association of Women Business Owners. We are lucky and grateful to have Rena and her expertise for these sessions. And with that, I'll hand it over to her.
Well, good morning to all of you. So I'm happy to be here discussing some of the more pressing conversations and frustrations around diversity and inclusion and how to address them. I want to emphasize on this one because I actually have a little ambivalence doing a webinar on diversity and inclusion, partly because this subject is so difficult. It's difficult because it's unique to every single organization. So what you may find walking away from this webinar is I'm talking in generality. But what I'm trying to give is at least a framework and some questions that you need to ask yourself at the board level and potentially at the organization or the staff level about what do we need to do to be more successful at this. So after an hour webinar, will you have a light bulb that goes on diversity and inclusion? Probably not. This is hard stuff. So I'm just trying to give you a framework and questions as you think about planning. I will say this again, this is really hard work. most people who even, invested a whole lot of time are surprised at how hard and difficult it is. So I'd like to say that up front. So when you put in the comments, like, this leaves me with nothing to do, it's hard in a webinar. But here's my hope. All of you are arts and culture organizations, and I think arts and culture organizations are uniquely positioned to bridge diverse communities, the way we think, styles, art forms. There's something about that in arts and culture organizations that can happen more organically than, say, in a social service or a housing organization. So you do have some assets and some strengths that hopefully you'll recognize and build upon. And I think that's really how to think about this. So let's talk about, I want to understand sort of what your problems are. So tell us about your board. This is a poll, whether it's diverse, but you want to improve. You've tried to enhance diversity, but you're struggling. You had diversity, but no longer. You're just starting with diversity and inclusion, or you have no idea what you're doing. So we'll give you a few minutes to respond, please. Okay, so it looks like just starting with diversity and inclusion is the highest response, and then try to enhance diversity but struggling. So, we're, okay, that's good. Probably where most organizations are. Let's move on. Another audience poll. My board's primary challenge with diversity and inclusion is attracting candidates but have difficulty with retention, difficulty with recruiting candidates, personality and culture clashes with diverse candidates. Diversity and inclusion is not a priority, or funders require that we do something. So take a few minutes to respond. So it looks like difficulty with recruiting candidates. Okay. That's, and some of you have attracted the candidates, but I've had a hard time. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So in today's agenda, we're going to begin to break down why it is difficult. We'll talk about there's barriers and understanding them and understanding your particular barriers to being. And I think once you understand your barriers, you will know where to attack first. And maybe thinking about how you begin to break through and do some of the foundational work that needs to happen before you can be successful at this. And then really get you thinking about your action plan. There was a handout. Hopefully, Andrew, you sent that out with questions that I think people should start thinking about how to answer as it relates to diversity and inclusion. This is really for you to format an action plan. I want you to walk away with at least sort of an outline of, how to move forward. So there's some key assumptions that I'm making here, that you have accepted the case for diversity and inclusion on your board. You've made that case at the board level. So your board understands why it's important to your organization. Some organization, it is inherent in their mission. It is potentially inherent in who they serve. Others, it might be because you believe that you will make better decisions with a more diverse board. So there's lots of reasons for having diversity inclusion on your board. I want you should have made the case and the board should have accepted this. If they haven't, then you need to go back to making the case for this. You cannot move forward until they understand and have accepted why you should have diversity and inclusion on your board. The other conversation that I'm assuming that you have had is that you understand what kind of diversity is important to you. So for a faith-based organization, it may be that you have people who are not of that faith on there. For a culturally specific organization, it might be to invite someone outside of that culture. For a dance organization, it may be to have a straight male on the board, because it is primarily a art form that attracts women, where people are strongly represented in the LGBTQ community, and to get a straight male might be the diversity that you need. So every organization is going to have a different vision of what diversity means for you. I actually work with a fair amount of culturally specific arts organizations. And I do know that is a challenge. It's like they can attract board members of their culture. It is those that are outside of it that are difficult to attract. And you have to think about how is your art, the way you operate, attractive to those organizations. So some of you know that I sit on the board of the Arts Alliance Illinois, and I'd like to talk a lot about diversity there, because we have, if you ask anyone on the board what diversity means to us, it is so many different levels. And I want you to sort of hear all the things that we talk about at the Board Development Committee. So we're a statewide organization. So that means downstate and upstate, Chicago and suburbs. And if any of you are aware of Illinois, the northern part of Illinois is looks and feels more like, is dominated by the Chicago metropolitan area. Downstate probably culturally is more like Kentucky, which is right across the border. So there's almost this civil war in our in our state, between the cultures, the northern culture and the southern culture. So there's diversity right there. We like arts executives, funders, corporate advocates for the arts. We like consultants. We like education institutions, arts making organizations, grant making. We look for the traditional markers of diversity in terms of race, ethnicity, sex, age. But we also have another layer of diversity in terms of the type of art: dance, museum, visual art, theater, film, music, vocal and instrumental, size of organization, small, medium, large. And then, of course, we're looking for skill expertise: legal, finance, marketing and PR, fundraising. So we have it all. And when I look around our board table, some of the conversations, because we have this diversity, even within the arts sector, we have some interesting conversations. I think we come to decisions, sometimes maybe in a little messy way, but I think in a better way. So the other caution that I will say is this may not be the challenge with arts organizations, but I do have a few clients who deal with populations that have been traumatized, and they want to have some representation on their board from those populations. I just caution you when you do that. If you have been dealing with a population that has experienced a lot of trauma, they may not be the best ones to serve. You need to screen them well, because I will say this across, every kind of demographic, every kind of person. You need to be healthy, happy, and whole to be an effective board member and to be able to navigate potential power plays at the board level. People who've been traumatized can be re-traumatized by a board experience, especially if you have any element of dysfunction on your board. So just be careful with that, and make sure that you're thinking about that. So let's talk about why is it so difficult. We'll talk about the 3 layers that make diversity and inclusion so difficult. And I'm going to do this through sharing a story that illustrates some of the challenges. I had a conversation with actually a friend of mine who's an African-American board member of an arts organization that serves youth of color. And I'm going to call him Jim, and he sits on ABC Youth Arts Organization. He conveyed to me that they were stalled in their diversity efforts. And personally, he was just frustrated and ready to step off the board. So he came to me because he knows I can sort of help him think about this problem. So as I helped Jim analyze the problem, I actually saw a pattern emerge in why just everyone throws up their hands with diversity and inclusion efforts. Some of the questions that I asked were, so who's leading the diversity and inclusion effort? How's it tied to the mission and strategic plan? How do you measure success? How long have you been working at this? And so what does your recruiting process look like? And how do you orient new members? Does the organization staff understand the need for diversity and inclusion? And how much time and money has been dedicated to diversity and inclusion? So Jim's response to many of those questions was, I don't know. I don't think we're doing well in that area. Or, it was not very positive. So those are some of the things that I think that you should start to ask yourself when you're thinking about diversity and inclusion. And so, as you'll see from Jim's situation, these were the three layers that I was dealing with Jim. So his board's composition was one Latina, one African American male, and the balance of the board was predominantly white males with corporate backgrounds. Jim made some suggestions regarding fundraising. He's had plenty of experience leading several nonprofits. His recommendations were dismissed as being too basic for the donors they were trying to reach. The board hired a fundraising consultant who recommended a plan that was similar to his. Jim made suggestions about recruiting for diversity at the board and staff level. They recognized the need, but wanted to rely on the professional recruiter who sat on the board, even though his specialty was not diversity. For the board, he sought senior executives with Fortune 500 companies that could provide resources and opportunities for the youth. For the staff, they were looking for management level experience in two roles, for fundraising and training. 6 months later, the recruiter hadn't produced any qualified candidates. So the recruiter claimed that those candidates were difficult to find or overcommitted. Jim knew that that was not the case. So when I asked Jim further questions, here's what I found out. Structurally, while the men on ABC Youth Arts Board work in different companies now, they had all worked together with each other at a consulting firm. The current chair recruited people he knew who were interested in the mission. So this organizational structure thing. So there's, consulting is not an industry known for its diversity. So they're naturally recruiting from a pool that doesn't have a lot of diversity. They're recruiting from a very tight-knit pool that probably looks like them. And they're recruiting from a pool that thinks like them. So it's a process that promotes a homogeneous board, culturally, thinking process, skills, background. And so many things that they were doing to reinforce sort of their exclusiveness as opposed to inclusion were structurally reinforcing. So they really had a weak or non-existent board recruiting process, and that's a structural thing. So, it's broken. They need to cast their pool wider. And then, this engagement and inclusion actually begins with the cultivation process, not when they're on the board. Candidates must be recruited and respected for the knowledge, skills, and value they can bring to an organization, regardless of their diversity program, and not be tokenized, which I think what Jim was feeling, that he was beginning to realize that he was recruited for his demographic profile rather than his work and leadership experience. And then if diversity and inclusion is not tightly linked to your mission, then you will struggle with this all the time. It needs to be relevant to the organization's priorities. Diverse candidates recognize this, and they will shy away from those situations. And then in general, if there is no money, time, or leadership dedicated to diversity initiatives, they will suffer. Many times diversity initiatives are tucked away in a narrow area. It's the responsibility of someone who doesn't have significant authority or budget. It's a paragraph in a strategic plan. It may not even be in the plan or mentioned in the annual report. This belongs at the C level. Should be the responsibility of the CEO or artistic leader or, whoever's the leader, and every person in the organization should have goals related to diversity and inclusion. Similarly, that should be happening at the board level. So the board should have some clear KPIs, key indicators that they're tracking around diversity and inclusion. And every organization's metrics that they should be establishing and following are going to be different. But it's got to be held at the board chair level. So I guess in some ways, don't push your diversity initiatives in this small area. It has got to be embedded in everything you do. So some of the cultural factors that are undermining sort of this diversity and inclusion effort at this arts organization is the fact that they feel comfortable with outside consultants. They're consultants, hiring consultants, all of whom were white, but much of the work could have been done with the talent on the board if all the ideas were considered, especially from diverse members. And then, another thing that I learned is that the board chair had a management style consistent with his former role on a consulting team. He led and then delegated to the rest of the board as he saw fit. He was not used to working in a more collaborative style as Jim had been doing most of his career. And I think this is goes across every single board in the nonprofit sector. If you have a lot of people on your board with corporate backgrounds, the way things get done in a corporate environment is very different from in a nonprofit environment, particularly an arts environment where it is, you collaborate to create your art. You collaborate across your organization to make things happen. That doesn't always happen in the private sector. And so it tends to be a little bit more hierarchical, or in some cases, very hierarchical, in terms of the way people make decisions and bring. And then I also think that there's some other cultural things is that Jim, and I think this is true among many communities of color, that communities of color are used to working in a more collective, collaborative style and may feel insulted by not being included. And so when you're asking someone who maybe experiences sort of being insulted in their day job on a daily basis to come volunteer for an organization that is going to dismiss their ideas, they don't want to have anything to do with that. So think about that. Think about how your culture on your board has to be more inclusive to allow people who have diverse viewpoints, perspectives, thinkers, and it's not always about the demographics, but anyone with an idea that is different from the norm, how you can be more inclusive of that. The other thing is, we need to recognize that there's an emotional reaction. And with Jim, all of this frustration had built up, and he had become more confrontational as his ideas continued to be dismissed or marginalized. He was perceived as being difficult and angry. Increasingly, he was left out of really important conversations because they just wanted to move forward. He didn't know what to do, but he realized he couldn't continue volunteering his time for an organization that did not value him for his contribution. So I want you to really think about, you know, I think many times people don't want to deal with the issue of diversity and inclusion because it is hard work. It requires difficult, uncomfortable conversations. And people tend to choose the path of least resistance and what may feel most comfortable, especially in a volunteer situation. I would argue that people choose that even in their day jobs, you know, when they're not volunteering. They don't want to have the difficult conversations that are necessary to really move diversity and inclusion forward. And then, you know, the other thing about diversity and inclusion is people think that it's a sort of a check the box thing. It is not. And I understand that at, you know, the operational level, or, you know, even at the board level, it seems like just one more thing to do. You know, we can't even afford our programs. Why are we going to expend resources on something that doesn't have an impact on our programs? Why hasn't the board not accepted the business case? You know, there's a lot of resistance because, and particularly if you're an organization that's coming off of a crisis, you're just living sort of piecing together things and living from year to year with not a lot of long-term planning or shoestring budget. It is a hard thing to do, to allocate resources to something that may not have some clear, measurable outcomes in the near term. So that's why it's important to get the board, you know, involved in talking about this. I want to talk a little bit, I want to go back up to cultural, because there's one thing that I think also at play in that story about Jim is unconscious bias. We all have it, and I think what we all need to do is recognize it. So these are the individual biases and thinking, that feeling, which, you know, we sometimes aren't consciously aware. You know, I have a bias to those who've excelled in creative professions, because, you know, I've tried the singing, dancing, and writing, and I know it takes tremendous discipline and talent to be at the top of your game. I'm also biased toward those who graduated from my alma mater, Georgetown. If you're a Hoyer, let's go. So there's all sorts of layers of biases, you know, beyond the obvious sort of, you know, racial and gender and sexual identity type of biases. Just watch out for the loaded words when you're talking about prospective board members. They are not a good fit. She's not ready. Too emotional, difficult, bossy, or bitchy, or, you know, girls don't like getting dirty. Just, we use a lot of language that is coded in so many ways in terms of reflecting our unconscious bias. So let's move on. So, you know, in understanding the barriers, those are the structural. And we talked a little bit about that. So it's those related to things outside of the organization and potentially inside the organization. You know, those long-standing institutional and economic barriers, and the way things are done internally from a structural level that preclude people being recruited and retained with diverse, who may be considered diverse candidates. And then there's the cultural, just really look at your board culture. We talked about it in a previous, I think the first one on broken engagement, really beginning to look at why your board will be a great place to have a board experience. You need to sort of whittle away the things that are happening at the board level that make it dysfunctional, discouraging, or and heighten the things that make it a positive experience for anyone sitting on the board. I mean, when you start to whittle away those things, you have great meetings. You value everyone's idea. People bond in a way that may be different than the way they bond elsewhere. They feel some camaraderie, that they're mission focused, that they're really making an impact in your organization. And then the emotional, sort of really getting down into sort of people's individual reactions, why they choose, to be on your board, why they are committed to doing the hard work, and how diversity and inclusion is valued and rewarded. So I'd like to take a poll now, and after the poll, we'll start to take questions. So tell me a little bit about, we've described those 3 layers of barriers in your organization, in an organization. Tell us what's your primary barrier: the organizational structure, cultural factors, emotional reaction, or maybe it's all of the above. It'll take a few minutes to do that. Okay. So it looks like all of the above, but I think, the cultural factors are, for the individual barriers. And honestly, some of those cultural factors are probably, easier, I'm not going to say they're easy, to attack than, say, maybe some of the emotional or organizational structure ones. So, I mean, if any of you who participated in the first webinar on engagement, a lot of the things, the work that you need to do is in that webinar around culture. So what, how to just work on getting more of your board members engaged and having tough conversations. So, Andrew, are there some questions?
We have one so far, and if just want to remind you, if anyone have any questions, to type them into the question field, and we'll get to them now or at the end of the session. So the first question is, regarding cultural factors, are there resources available for how African Americans prefer to work together, how Asian or Latin Americans prefer to work together, such as articles describing cultural approaches to working with others, videos, etc. I think it's about bridging cultural divides.
So I'd like to say that there's a one-size-fits-all for everything. There probably are things out there. I can't reference it off the top of my head. At the end of this webinar, there's a list of some resources that are more about sort of generalities about, particularly around racial equity, which, I think is a hot topic. And I don't know if you noticed, I did not talk about equity in this because I think it's hard to achieve at the board level. until you conquer diversity and inclusion. So it's usually all lumped together, diversity, equity, and inclusion. But at the board level, you know, it's a tough thing to deal with and might need to be dealt with separately. So I guess what I would caution you about is I think the average person of any ethnicity believes that their culture is not monolithic. And so what works with African Americans in one community or of one strata may not work with others. Similarly, Asian Americans, because there's all kinds of Asian Americans, and what works with one group may not work with another. Honestly, I think the best way to work and understand is to have relationships deep in those communities, whether it's forging partnerships with other maybe culturally specific organizations, or, you know, bringing in people, consultants who may know of those communities. So that's what I would say. Any other questions?
That is all we have for now. So just a reminder, please type in any questions. Oh, we just got one in. We are struggling with attracting younger board members. We tend to be a white, middle-aged organization. We want to develop a next generation of volunteer-based /board. Any thoughts on how to appeal to this group?
Can you repeat the question again?
Sure, it's about attracting younger board members and volunteers. We are struggling with attracting younger board members. We tend to be a white, middle-aged organization. We want to develop our next generation volunteer-based /board. Any thoughts on how to appeal to this group?
Yeah, so honestly, there's a couple ways to do it. I know a lot of organizations try to develop a young professionals organization. I hate to say board, but that can, because young people want to be with young people, particularly if they are, you know, single and still trying to have fun, you know. So a young people's organization is a way to do that. I caution organizations in sort of segregating young people, one, because it's one other group that the staff has to manage. You know, I'm not a big proponent of young professional boards or any kind of council or anything for that reason, until you have your governing board together, because it takes away resources from the governance perspective. It may be that what you decide is to proactively go after someone who's younger to serve on your board. And I think it's more about how you sell it to someone. Is if they believe in your mission, the work that you're doing, it's an opportunity for them to develop professionally and have an opportunity to network with maybe people who are more well-connected. But recognizing that part of what you're valuing them for is their different perspectives. So it's hard. It's hard to cultivate young people in a way that's organic unless it naturally comes out of your art form. So I don't know if without knowing the specifics of an organization, it's hard for me to make specific specific recommendations. But there's usually a way to get that voice of the young person either directly or indirectly through maybe potentially events, but it is also, you have to think about the time that staff have to do to cultivate and support them.
All right, we have 3 more questions that just came in. So the first one of those is, if changing the structure means letting go of some homogenous board members, the conversation can get tough, especially if they may be extremely dedicated board members. Any ideas on how to work through that process?
Yeah, so if organizations are really committed to this, then people will recognize that the board needs to change. So the other thing is, I don't know that you really want to lose people who are very dedicated. I would also think about, how do you expand the board to include those diverse, diverse candidates. Usually most boards are only constrained by their bylaws. You can change the bylaws. If what you want to do is to be more inclusive, it's okay to be bigger to make that happen, as opposed to losing someone who has deep commitment. They're not mutually exclusive. Like you don't have to lose people to gain that diversity. If that's sort of the choice that you feel you have to make, I would sort of wonder how well diversity and inclusion will be accepted by the current board.
All right, we have 2 more right now, so maybe we'll get through these and then we'll take any other questions at the end. So the next one is, are voluntary reading lists and group board and staff workshops on white fragility and white privilege helpful?
I guess yes, in the sense that everybody needs to do some personal work around their own unconscious biases, the privilege that exists, or if you are still in the formative stages of making the case for diversity and inclusion. Because I'm sure there are a lot of board members who still, if you ask them the question, do you think that there should be diversity and inclusion, they won't understand why. But I don't know that making diversity and inclusion work is simply about white people recognizing their privilege. Sometimes it's about just recognizing that different voices need to be heard, regardless of who's saying it. So there's almost diversity of thinking. I think we're also challenged at the Arts Alliance Illinois, is that we talk a lot about that. Many times we're preaching to the choir, because we have all the people around the table who believe in, art is a powerful weapon. But we don't have people around the table, or we're talking to, who may be skeptical about it. And so do we have that diversity at the table? Or maybe who think about art in a different way and may push it a little further. So I guess I'm sort of saying yes, but no on that question. Let's go to the next question.
Okay, this will be the last one for now, and then we have a couple others we'll get to at the end. As a mixed race, I work with an organization that offers arts engagement to adults recovering from homelessness and trauma associated with homelessness. You mentioned a caution recruiting from a population who has experienced trauma. Some of the board feels it is important they are represented. I understand this is delicate. Can you discuss a little more?
Yeah, so I actually sat on a board that, and I'll give you a very specific way that it worked for us. I sat on a board that dealt with, they were affordable housing developer, they did supportive housing, and the population were people who were formerly homeless. So lots of trauma, potentially lots of mental illness. But what naturally happened is at all of our buildings, we had leadership councils. So the tenants in our buildings voted these people to lead at every single location. And from those tenant councils emerged some clear leaders, people who had conquered their sobriety. They were working outside of the building. They were connecting with their family. They were being supported with counseling. They were doing very productive things. They had turned around their lives and they had been stable with their housing, with their emotional health, with their jobs and had a track record. And everyone in the organization recognized them as leaders. And those were the people that ran for the tenant seat on the board. And so there was a natural screening process to get those healthy, whole, happy people who could really contribute with their lived experience on the board. And then, you know, our board was required to give or get $3,000. Clearly, someone who was low income, formerly homeless, could not raise, they just didn't have the network. So we had a different level of giving. We wanted them to give, and they wanted to contribute. So their giving level was $250, and the staff at the building supported them in running a bake sale. And so while, you know, they had a lot of support from the counselors in the organization. So there's a lot of things you can do to support someone who you're serving because you want their voice on the board, but recognize their path on the board may have to be a different path than someone who has not been through that trauma, and recognize that screening process is really important. You know, I described, you know, this with the organization and we got some great people, like almost, they were like model citizens in many respects because of that screening process. And I'll contrast that with a client that put someone on the board who was still struggling with the trauma that they had experienced early. And so every conversation was almost, he felt it was a personal attack because he still hadn't dealt with how to navigate relationships well when, you know, there's power differences. So I hope that helps. Let me keep moving because we got to finish. And I hope those answering those questions helped. So when you're thinking about breaking through the barriers, it's about awareness of the culture, leadership, and values that may support or hinder diversity and inclusion efforts. I encourage people to do assessments or surveys. There's lots of diversity, cultural awareness surveys. There's unconscious bias. Some of the resources that I list at the end, if you start to click through them, they have some specific recommendations around that. Also, you can just Google it, and you'll find sort of the answer to that. Typically, when I lead board self-assessments, there's a whole section on diversity and inclusion and trying to get at that culture issue around the board. So that usually forms, when the board has done that assessment or survey work, then you can start to have conversations at the board level, potentially at the staff level. I would recommend doing exit interviews from recent board members who've resigned, especially diverse candidates, understanding what they liked about the board, what they didn't like, what was a turnoff. You should be able to review people's assumptions and biases in a really safe environment. So, when you're doing this awareness, it's also, the symptom may be that you have a weak diversity and inclusion effort, but the real problem may come from a lack of leadership or execution in other areas. So the other part is acceptance. Acceptance that this is a long, hard road that needs leadership and resources. It's a journey. This is, I think, the number one thing you can take away from it. Diversity and inclusion is a change management initiative. And for those of you who've tried to do change management, you understand that there are multiple layers, the people, the processes, the programs that need to happen. And it requires investment, it requires a strategy, it requires leadership, and potentially evaluation and, adjusting to it. So, structural, when you're trying to break through that structural barrier, it's not just the internal. It's also in your business practice, your staff, your board, your vendors. Your diversity and inclusion should show up in what you do, how you look, who you partner with, and not only in what you say. Your commitment should go beyond a stated plan. And, I would ask you, since you're all art, does it show up in your art? Or does it show up in your art outreach? Here in Chicago, there are a number of organizations who you might call traditionally attracting a dominant culture in their audiences. But now they're going out into communities. One of my clients, the Grant Park Music Festival, they do classical music. They're going out into the parks, in the neighborhoods, in various communities throughout the city and performing, because part of it, is, giving people access, giving people opportunity. They have a fellows program where they're grooming young, diverse artists in terms of the chorus that they have and the orchestra, and so that they have opportunities to thrive. So you will see more diversity on the Grant Park Music Festival stage than you will see in the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, partly because they've been very intentional about it. And once again, this is a change management industry. Some of what you're doing, may change at the board level, but, sometimes we're faced with structural barriers in the industry. And, I'll give you an example. When I did work on that affordable housing developers board, we were faced with, we're spending literally multi-million-dollar projects where we're investing in buildings in communities that are blighted, but we are not hiring contractors or having people work on our buildings who reflect the community. So there was a recognition that we needed to go over and above to have, diversity initiatives to create jobs, because it was core to our mission. Creating jobs for people who have been structurally cut out of the job pipeline was really important to us. And so it may have cost us a little bit more in terms of contracting and everything, but we felt like we could not go into communities that were experiencing blight and disinvestment and not invest in the core part of our mission. We did jobs. So that's, one of the things that's really important to think about that. You have to think about your approach to recruiting. You may have to be more expansive. It may take more time. You may have to network with more people. You may have to be really thoughtful about who the next person it is that you bring on the board. You have to look outside traditional channels. It's hard work. And develop goals and measures for your impact, not just numbers. It's not enough to have X number of minority board members. You need to have people of color or people who are not traditionally on your board that have contributed to advancing the mission and supporting the strategic plan. Who can add real value, or else otherwise they will continually feel like they are on the fringes. So some of it that is that cultural, creating the right environment for inclusion, healthy conversations, supporting new diverse members with mentors and help them build strong relationships throughout the board. Give them board buddies. Mentorship in the corporate world still works on the board at the board level. And then emotionally, it's this willingness to do the hard work and sometimes feel uncomfortable. And accepting that it's a change management effort and requires a major commitment, and really acknowledging people's fears that going along with change and adding someone who's different onto the board, it is. I mean, there's some fears that people have about that, particularly if they aren't used to stretching their thinking, their network in a way that makes them feel different or maybe uncomfortable. So, what does it take? I mean, I think most organizations are moving, are at the transactional level. They're trying to do the recruiting. It's on an ad hoc basis. They're just thinking about it. Oh, we need X person for do X things. But you really need to move to being more transformational, thinking about the mission, your culture. How do you train people? How do you do the ongoing training that's necessary? The orientation when you bring people on, but the ongoing training that the board needs that, throughout their time on the board, and putting some dollars and real resources behind it, whether it's at the staff level, whether you bring in consultants, whether you commit to spending the time and the money needed to do this. This is a change management effort. And to really move to where you're accountable, where leadership, the board chair and the CEO must be on board. Let me just say this. If your board chair and your CEO don't believe in diversity and inclusion, they have not adopted the case, they have not made some clear goals, you almost need to hang it up. So that is key. With that, things move faster, move stronger. It's not to say that it's impossible for change to happen. It just, you're going to be like banging your head against the wall if the board chair and the CEO aren't on board. You need to make it a part of your strategy and part of your strategic plan. You need to have some clear outcomes at key points of where you're trying to go. You need to evaluate it periodically, annually, quarterly, however you decide to do. And then think of it not as an expense, but an investment. And so that's how you move from being transactional to accountable. So I've attached sort of a list of, questions to ask, but, whether you're starting fresh or jump-starting an existing effort, how will we know we're successful? I mean, if I asked you today, would the board be able to say with a unifying voice, what you're trying to achieve? Who should be involved? What should be the priorities? When should you start or expand? How long will it take? How do we measure it? I mean, fundamentally, what needs to change at every level? And then what kind of resources are we going to have to allocate to this? So these are, we're coming to the end. I want to allow some time for a few questions. It's really about understanding your barriers at, those three levels: structural, cultural, emotional. Here's a list of resources. And as you can see, some of them are about racial equity. One of the things, the first one, the board source, leading with intent. It talks, actually, it's a great survey that Board Source does every other year, but the thing that came out of that was boards fundamentally have not changed in terms of their racial composition in 20 years. They are still predominantly white. They are still predominantly male. That's it at the board level, board chair, and CEO. And most boards don't have it. Even though they want the diversity and inclusion, they have not made diversity and inclusion a priority. I think that's what you will get out of that report, at least as it relates to diversity and inclusion. There's a lot of other statistics there that are very valuable that you can read about. But I've listed some other things that you can read. Honestly, I think what's come out recently is this toolkit, number 3, Equity in the Center. Click on that. It's a toolkit to think about racial equity at a whole bunch of levels. It's really deep. It's very powerful. It's good. There's some resources on the Race to Lead organization. Google has made their, how to undo unconscious bias available to people. So that's free. It's used throughout Google. And then there's a blog by View Lay, who actually talks about, he deals with a lot of issues around cultural, racial equity. And I thought this was a really good article on things you can do to improve the state of diversity and inclusion. So really, when you start thinking about this, diversity and inclusion, it's got to be mission driven. It's got to be embedded in who you are, sort of your mission. And that's why diversity for every single organization on this call will have a different definition, because your missions are different. Leadership has to embrace it on the board and the staff level. And think about impact. How are you going to impact your organization, your community, your art? Think about how diversity and inclusion makes you a better organization, able to deliver better on your mission. And it's a journey. It's a journey. It's going to take a long time to get there. So don't expect that this webinar is going to get you there. You've got to invest. So more questions.
Sure. And before I start the questions, just want to note that we will be sending out a PDF of the slides, which will include that resources page with clickable links. So the first question is, as a mixed race executive of a predominantly Caucasian organization, I find it challenging to bring up issues of diversity and inclusion. Beyond bringing in someone else to talk to the staff and board about the challenges of our existing homogenous institutional culture, any questions, any suggestions?
Yeah, and so I assume this is an executive director who's sitting on the staff side and trying to deal with a board that is predominantly white. You need some kind of champion at the board level, and ideally it's the board chair. Potentially maybe even, the board development or nominating chair, someone who has an influence over the recruiting process. And you need to have a one-on-one conversation with them. Because, I think the other thing is, I think, the voice and the champion has to come from, both sides, the staff and the board level. The advocate and the champion should come from a wide group of perspectives on the issue. So it's really getting that buy-in at the board level for someone to lead it at the board level and rally the troops to see that it's valuable. There's lots of resources to give them the data around it. I mean, there's lots of research on, it has been proven for a very long time that diversity and inclusion on boards, whether you're corporate or nonprofit, results in better decision making and just overall higher performance. The results are clear. So it's about sort of beginning to get someone on the board who's in a leadership position to do some of that leading on the issue. I think we might have time for one more question.
Sure, we'll close out with this one. What is one thing people listening to this webinar could do today to improve diversity and inclusion tomorrow or ASAP?
I'm assuming you're talking about the board.
Yeah.
I actually think it's just having a difficult conversation. And it doesn't have to be around diversity and inclusion. It can be around anything, because I think fundamentally what's holding people back from diversity and inclusion is the unknown or the things that they don't want to talk about. So when you're able to have one difficult conversation, whether it's about programs or whatever, you may get the skills and the strength to have a difficult conversation about diversity and inclusion. I've facilitated many conversations at the board level about this, and it's not easy. You may walk away and say, "Oh, we've had the conversation, but now where's the action?" I would also say that if the difficult conversation you want to have is around diversity and inclusion, then I would say don't have it without some key takeaways, some action steps, and putting it in the responsibility of a task force and or multiple committees to make things happen. But I would say maybe even before that, I'm going to back up. The number one conversation you should have is with the board chair. Because if the board chair is not on board, you can forget about it. So I think that was multiple things to do. So
yeah, thanks. We're going to have to wrap up there. Thank you everyone for joining us at ArtsFund for our webinar, Breaking Down Barriers, Achieving Real Board Diversity and Inclusion with Rena Henderson Mason from Bold Agenda. And thank you so much to Rena for your great all three great presentations that you've done with us. As I said at the top, this program is part of our annual convening series sponsored by the Boeing Company. Before you go, I want to remind you, you'll be receiving a survey in follow-up to this webinar, and we ask that you please fill it out to help us at ArtsFund set the course for future programs like this. I will also share the action planning question document that Rena mentioned and the slides from this session with that resources page with clickable links. Please also contact me if you would like to receive information about the webinar recording, or if you have any other questions, you can contact me at andrew@artsfund.org. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you.